Well, welcome. I'm Sue Murray, President of the Hartland Land Trust, and Bill Bentley will be presenting today on global forestry. He's with the Salmon Brook Associates, and he's also with the Horace B. Clark Woods Advisory Committee here in town. He's done a lot of traveling. I've seen one of his presentations, so he's been about the world, and he has a lot of information, and he has a great presentation. So please welcome Bill. Thank you very much.
Thanks. This quite all his traveling. My father was a little concerned that the sheriff was after me, so he was kind of happy when I finally settled down in Granby. Anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is talk about global forestry, but I'm going to use 2 points to compare and contrast with. One is the United States, because we're all sort of familiar with our own history and the abundance of forest we have. And then I'm going to use India as the counterpoint. India is a rapidly developing nation, but until quite recently was viewed as terribly poor. We have some interesting historic ties with India in the field of forestry, as well as other things. And I first went to India in 1982, and then I came back and lived there for 3 years. So I've got sort of a personal tie that makes it easier for me to talk about India than Brazil, Costa Rica, or some other place. So that's why we're going to use India. I can go in greater or lesser depth as I sort of see how you're responding. So you may find me jumping a little bit as we find things that we're more interested in rather than less. This presentation originally grew out of a thing I do regularly up at Syracuse in the Maxwell School for Public Administration. We are training the top forestry leaders in the Indian Forest Service. And they spend 2 weeks in India, one at the beginning and one at the end of a month-long period. And then they spend 2 weeks in the United States. There's a counterpart to spending 2 weeks in Canada. And the idea is to expose them to different ideas of how the world works and get them to kind of turn around and say, gee, some of these other folks have problems just like ours, and here's how they solve them. And to get them thinking out of their own box. And one of the nice things for folks like me is it's allowed me to think out of my box because India is so different. So, no further ado, I'm going to do a little overview about the ties between here and India, then we'll talk about global issues, we'll talk about forest history in the United States, and some contrast with India, and then I will spend some time on global climate change, because forestry is a very important part of solving that. I'm going to visit a village in India called Sukumadri, and some lessons, and then we'll kind of summarize what we've heard. As I say, I can jump around a little bit here. Okay. One of the reasons for talking about India is we do have this common ground. Most of you know who Gifford Pinchot is. He was born in Simsbury. He was the first American trained as a professional forester. He went to Nancy, France to get that training. The first Inspector General of Forestry in India was a man named Dietrich Brandis, who was a German, Prussian actually. And after he retired as Inspector General of Forest, he went back to Germany, which he had been for 30 or 40 years, and by happenstance was the tutor of Gifford Pinchot. And in that era, rather than sitting around in the classroom, once you learn to hold your cocktail glass properly and play the hunting horn, you learn forestry by traveling and looking at things and so forth, which in many respects is a much better way to learn forestry than sitting in a classroom. One of the keys in this comparison is our United States Forest Service flows very directly from the experience that Brandis had. There's some pictures of these fellows. There's Gifford Pinchot. Some of you will recognize him, but a typical fellow of his era, mustache. He was properly trained at Yale before he went off. His father was a merchant, builder of wallpaper in New York City. So that doesn't sound like too big a deal, but in the post-Civil War period of time, when all of a sudden you had a lot of rich people producing high-quality wallpapers for the elite was a good way to make a lot of money. He did. His mother was an Eno, who was one of the first families of Simsbury, so that's the connect. This dandy chap down here is Mr. Brandis, and he was off in Siam, what we now know as Thailand, putting together forestry for the British Thai Empire of the time. And when in 1857 there was a sort of a civil war, revolution in India, and the Indians tried to throw the Brits out, probably with good reason. The British India people figured out they needed telegraph lines, they needed railroads, railroad ties, and wood to fuel the engines. Therefore, we need to be able to manage our forests. And the British had absolutely no idea how to manage forests. So they turned to a Prussian, Mr. Brandis, who had, Germany already had a rich and long tradition in scientific forestry, and brought him in as the first Inspector General. And we had a sequence of Germans and Brits, and before World War II, finally India succeeding to these leadership roles. So, Pitcho, a man named Ferdinand, was another Prussian, and Schenck, another Prussian, introduced many forestry ideas from India. Forest mensuration, which is the measurement of trees, the diameter, height, volume, and all that sort of thing. Silvicultural systems, how we manage our forests, including the Clark tract over here. And then forestry research, because the Germans were deeply embedded in applied science about understanding their forests. And interestingly enough, while the U.S., we developed largely around an agricultural science tradition, there it was around botanical science. And we continue to have lots of interactions, learning from each other. So this isn't just something that happened back in the late 1800s. The Indian Forest Service precedes our Forest Service by quite a bit. It was formed right about the time our Civil War ended, and it wasn't until 1905 that our Forest Service evolved. In 1878, professional forestry education began in India with a lot of ties to European forestry schools, particularly German. And it wasn't until 1898 that the first professional forestry program started at Cornell. People in Connecticut will tell you it was Yale, it wasn't. But Cornell went out of business early on, and Yale is the oldest program. I taught at the College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, and so Syracuse Forestry School, and it started just 100 years ago, and was still among the early programs in the U.S. In 1976, there was quite a revolution in thinking about agriculture, forest, and so forth in India, and began a program of social forestry involving poor people in the management of lands, involving farmers, farm forestry, agroforestry, the mixing of trees and crops. And India has led in these arenas worldwide, so people from all sorts of third world countries will go to India to learn. And then in the 1990s, the joint management of forestry programs where the public and private sectors are very involved with the management of public forests, but the public in the sense of participation. And from about 1974 on, we had a parallel policy in the United States. Now, Brandis recognized, came into India just as India was recovering from this basically civil war, civil insurrection. The Indian government was centered by this time in what we now know as New Delhi, Old Delhi, and the British India extended from the Khyber Pass in Pakistan today to Dhaka in Bangladesh today, to the Nepal border to Ceylon, or what we now know as Sri Lanka. So a huge geographical span and very poor communication. So how do you organize a Forest Service to follow some kind of central ideas and yet have enough autonomy to deal with the peculiar aspects of where they are? And Brandis came up with this idea of an inspector general, which he was, that each state or principality would have a principal chief conservator. They would have conservator of forest groups of forest lands, and then assistant conservator. And when Pinchot took over what became the American Forest Service, he faced a very similar problem. He said, in Washington, D.C., the bulk of the forestry in the American West recognized how primitive the West was at that time. It was largely treated by the East as a colonial empire. It was full of folks that they didn't fully know what to do with, like the American Indians. And so he came up with a very similar model, and that model survives today in both countries. And it's because it's an interesting balance point between trying to have a uniform set of policies and allowing local discretion and putting authority locally on accountability. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some global issues and the relative scale of forests and trade and so forth. Now, this is a global picture of where the forests are in the world, the various colors of green of the forest. And part of what stands out here is there's just a whole lot of the world that doesn't have forests. There are deserts, there are grasslands, there are mountaintops, all sorts of things. Australia is very notable. The forests are kind of along the eastern and northern periphery. Any of you who've been to Australia have seen pictures of the great outback. There's not much in the way of woody vegetation. The concentration of forests are in this northern area across Canada, the northern U.S., across northern Europe and northern Russia, and then through the central part in Latin America, Africa, and on out into Indonesia. And there are a few other isolated things. The south temperate forest is limited to parts of Australia, New Zealand, and southern South America, namely Chile and Argentina. What this shows is the areas where deforestation has been going on for some time. Oddly enough, Australia is one of those places. But you see, on the whole, it's areas that we think of as developing and poor, where deforestation is going on. The green areas are areas of expansion of forest. More forest, bigger forest, taller forest. Note that the darkest green is China. China currently is planting more trees, more plantations, more systematic recovery of watershed lands than any other nation in the world. So it's not just in making widgets that they're showing up the rest of us. Okay, there's about 13 billion acres of land area in the world. The bulk of it is known forest. Natural forests are a little bit more than a quarter, and that small wedge are the plantation forests, forests that are actually planted with some systematic organization. Think of your orchard. If those of you who traveled in the south or the northwest, you see a lot of plantations in both areas. When I first used this diagram, it was 1%. It's now 3%. It will soon be 5% and then 10%. And largely shifting from natural forest to plantation forest is the biggest source. There is some reclamation of non-forest land. We'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, here's where the forest land is. What's interesting is that North and Central America are important, but look at South America, look at Africa, look at Europe, and look at where all the people are out in Asia. So relative to our population, we've got enormous resources, but it's always surprising to Americans how much Europe has. So the forest area, Canada and the US, big. Russia. You go into the Russian Far East or Siberia, and you're looking at virtually all forests from the China border as far north as you can grow anything. There's a lot of Russia where you can't grow anything. Brazil. So Canada, Brazil, and Russia are the big heavyweights. US and China some other countries way in there, and then you can see other countries that are kind of small. Industrial roundwood. Now, this is a term that foresters use, and it just makes a whole lot of sense to us. Somebody's sitting up there saying, what in the heck is industrial roundwood? It's logs. It's logs that you can cut off into timber, make into pulpwood. It's things that are the raw material for industrial inputs. So logs that you can measure and can make widgets out of, those are industrial roundwood. Other kinds of wood includes fuel wood, which, as we'll see, is actually more important. We're the heavyweight. Canada is our partner in that. You combine the two of us together and everybody else is a peanut. That's for now. Consumption. We produce a lot, we use a lot. Not surprising, actually. I mean, people use raw material that's relatively inexpensive and that they understand how to use. Here in the Northeast, we have a lot of houses made out of wood. You move towards the south, you see a lot more brick. If you move in certain other parts of the country, like certain parts of the Midwest, you see stone houses and so forth. China is consuming more and more, and that consumption more and more is coming from other places, including us. So wood exports are very important to us, wood imports are very important to them. This just shows wood pulp. We dominate wood pulp in North America. Europe's very important. The rest of the world is, relatively speaking, minor players. But Asia is growing. Saw timber, Europe, United States, and Asia are the big producers of saw timber, that industrial roundwood, for purposes of making lumber and plywood and so forth on it. Now, this is important because we harvest more wood in cubic meters or cubic feet, however you want to measure, for fuel wood than we do for any of the industrial purposes. And in Asia and Africa, that's why wood's really important. We can talk all night about the value of their timber for logs, industrial roundwood, etc. But that's not the real importance when we get to the village level. It's fuel wood. And this shows the same picture. See where the darker green is fuel wood, see where Africa, how Africa looks, Asia looks, and then the rest of the world is not terribly important until we get down to South America. And again, you're dealing with a lot of rural, relatively poor people. It's a cheap source of energy for them. Now, I recognize I made this slide originally for Indians. Indians grew out of a history of central planning. Under Nehru and post-Britain India, India had a lot of central planning, modeled in part on the Soviet model. Not quite the same kind of command and control. They didn't generally go out and lop people's heads off, but that kind of notion of social direction. Part of the U.S. is interesting character is that we've never had a unified policy with regard to our forest at the national level and virtually none at the state level. And that's one of the interesting contrasts between us and many other countries. And there's some reasons for that. Deforestation is part of our story. Over here is Connecticut. It was almost 100% covered with forest when Europeans showed up. We took that down to 20% or so by about the time the Civil War started, and then it built up until about 1950, and then it's kind of been up and down since then. What we're seeing here is development. The conversion of forests to houses, the conversion of forests to malls, the conversion of forests to highways. Same picture nationwide. You see the south, abrupt drop as we move past the colonial period. In the north, an equally abrupt drop, and then slow recovery. The Pacific coast, with those great big Douglas fir trees, had a drop, but it wasn't near as precipitous, in large part because there isn't that much forest out there. It's really commercial. The big trees are enormous, the redwoods, the Douglas fir, but there's an awful lot of forests in the west that are high or dry and not terribly productive. Rocky Mountains illustrates that same point. So the current deforestation is not like the deforestation we experienced following European settlement. It's generally not like that observed in the tropics, except for some very local areas. And the forest clearing was followed by natural old field stands, and now we're having slow losses from development. Okay, here's the US forest. We have about 3/4 of a billion acres of forest land. About 500 million of those acres are what we call commercial. And this is a definition that is strictly biological. Do they produce enough wood per acre per year to be worthwhile trying to manage for that industrial roundwood? And that's about 2/3 of our forest land. The other third is in wilderness areas, national parks, and lands that are high, dry, or otherwise just not very productive, the bulk of which are in the American West. The bulk of which are in public ownership, really federal ownership, national forests, national parks, national monuments, and so forth and so on. The important number to note here is the ownership of small private ownership. I own, my wife and I own, I should be correct here, own about 38 acres of woodlands down in North Granby. And those woodlands date back in part to natural regeneration and in part to my father-in-law as a young lad and his brother and his father planting white pine very extensively on old pastures. This would be a typical small owner. There are some small owners in the south that are several hundred acres, but the bulk of these small ownerships are 100 or less acres. Very different than the industrial holdings, very different than the public forests, including the tribal forests. And this has a lot to do with why we don't have a forest policy in our country. Forest policies work best if the public owns the forests. They work best in the sense of being rational and sensible. They may not actually work the best in terms of social needs. When you've got a lot of different owners, you've got a lot of different goals and perspectives, and the government telling you what to do is not a very popular thing, particularly right at the moment in our society, but it never has been. We're a nation of people who came from someplace else, and part of the reason we came here was we didn't much like the king or whatever kind of government they had wherever we came from. But these small ownerships are the most vulnerable to conversion or partialization, and they have the biggest potential to produce our demand for wood, watershed protection, wildlife, carbon sequestration, and all sorts of other things that we like from forests. We have got a lot of forests that are on the edge, 44 million acres, and I'll show you what that means. These are the forests that are on the edge of major urban areas. You can see it's dominated by the east, but those are areas where the demand for small holdings for recreation and the push for development is greatest. So 44 million acres between now and 2030 may convert simply because of this population pressure coupled with money. And that's the biggest difference between our population growth and, say, the growth of population in India or China, where the population growth is happening there. Those people don't have much money. Our population has, by relative standards, an awful lot of money. When we talk about fragmentation, this is a map of an area in Greene County, New York, that in 1984, you see, was largely large block holdings. Mere 16 years later, see how it was fragmented into these small holdings. Some of that was just breakup of land as you pass from one generation to the other. Others were breaking up the land to get the money out of it. So both pressures happen. And we see this throughout the United States where we have private holdings. Now this is interesting because there's a lot of different reasons people own forests. beauty, scenery, privacy, nature protection, part of the home, hunting, fishing, blah, 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 blah. Notice that timber production, firewood production, and non-timber forest products are at the bottom of the list. This, of course, is what foresters like me were trained for almost 100 years to help people produce on their small forests. And it wasn't terribly effective because that's not really what these small owners were interested in. Now, there is one place that fits into that is inheritance and land investment. So those are mixed in. And people are not oblivious that the 46 acres of pasture, cropland, and timberland that my wife and I own, there's a lot of good things about that. It's in a conservation easement with the Granby Land Trust, that's a good thing. But that land gets more and more valuable, and as Will Rogers said, they ain't making any more of it. So that land will grow in value without us doing much of anything about it. That then is an asset that can be passed on, be given to people, be sold. And it has more value now because of that conservation easement than it probably would have had without it. The easement's been on for almost 20 years, simply because large blocks of protected land are scarce. It's right next to a high meadow. It's next to a number of other relatively large ownerships. It's an attractive thing for people. So are we oblivious to those values? No, we're not. We don't own it because of them, but we're not oblivious to them either. That's kind of typical. I'm going to skip this. This isn't really important to what we're going to talk about tonight. We look at global issues, critical issues, and right now I would list climate change as the #1 global forestry issue. It's #1 for two very different reasons. One, forests sequester carbon. As they grow, as they live, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they make wood out of it. And they store it. So you've sequestered that carbon, you've taken it out of the atmosphere, and if you produce things that last a long time, like wood furniture, wood houses, etc., you store it for a very long time. So you're not only getting the 50 to 100 year storage while you're growing the tree, you might get another 100, 200 years. We've got beams in our barn that have been in place for 150 years, and it probably took them 150 years to get that big. So we've stored that carbon for a long time. The other reason, though, is deforestation, which isn't simply tropical, but that's where we find it. And figuring out how to slow that down or stop it, and trying to understand why it continues, is an important part of the global issue. Now this green thing that goes up and down every year, but it steadily gets bigger. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere in recent years. And the interesting thing about it, you can see it oscillates every year. So it reaches a peak and then it drops back again. It reaches a peak, so it's a little bit like a sawtooth. That peak drops back as the north temperate forests turn on every spring. That's what we're seeing here. It's the north temperate forest worldwide starting to grow every spring, and it sucks the carbon dioxide down. Now, trend-wise, that's just a big fat line. But understanding that annual flux is critical to understanding the role that forests do play and could play in this. The bottom one is this is a fairly famous picture off of Mauna Loa, which shows the carbon dioxide cycles over the last 700,000 years. And yeah, Governor Perry is right. The weather and carbon dioxide, etc., go in cycles. But right now, that spike goes quite up to the top of that graph. And that's the last 100 to 150 years. That is not part of the cycle that we're looking at. So trees are especially effective. These foresters look at forest-based solutions like afforestation, reforestation, and so forth. I'm working with a group of people on creation of carbon offsets, marketing of those carbon credits to polluters as a way to make the market help solve this problem. But sustainable forestry is more important than the carbon offsets right at the moment. I poked fun at the Congress last year. I used the same slide and poked fun at Sarah Palin. But there are people who don't agree that we've got climate change and it's caused by people. That just doesn't stand the test of science. We do have definitively increasing temperatures, another climate change, and those are clearly associated with human activity. The degree and the amount, whatever, those are worth debating, but the broad facts are not. They're just there. This is our old friend Al Gore up there applauding himself. Mr. Pachauri, I worked with his wife when I worked in India, and know Pachi pretty well as a colleague. We aren't close friends or anything, but this is a really bright guy who is an economist with a strong biological science background, who led this international climate change work that the UN sponsored. Okay. The most important symptom at the global level is we've got all these different sources of carbon dioxide. Deforestation's contribution is difficult to estimate, but it's give or take 20%. Might be as high as 25%, might be as low as 18%. But compared to oil, natural gas, and coal, it's pretty important. It's not quite as important, but on a scale of 1 to 10, if those are 10s, this is an 8 or a 7. It's big enough to worry about. So why does deforestation continue is an important global issue. And the answer isn't simple, and there's more than one answer, but if we could answer that in each place where it's important, we go a long ways. We can cut that 20% down to 10%, or that 10% down to 5%. That's a lot easier in the short run than cutting coal, oil, and natural gas down in terms of their contribution to carbon dioxide. In the tropical developing nations, India, which is one, but we think particularly today there was some things going on in the Congo. We talk about things going on in Brazil and various other tropical nations, Indonesia. It's often related to agricultural development. And in fact, for many years, the World Bank promoted the conversion of forests into croplands and pasture lands. As recently as when I was a youngster, growing up in California, it made sense to convert marginal redwood lands into pasture lands. I look back on that, I just, what were we thinking? But it made sense to some of the people, and they did it. Sometimes it's tied to firewood harvesting. Now, most of the places where I've worked, and aside from India and South Asia, I've worked a bit in Southeast Asia, a bit in Africa, not much in Latin America, but the firewood harvesting that causes problems usually follows logging. So you've got poor people, particularly women, going in and getting firewood, but so that precludes some of the regeneration. The more likely cause is animals. There's just nothing like having a set of cows running through your woods to prevent little trees from growing. But the most common problem is ill-defined property rights and rural poverty. And property rights are so strongly defined here in the United States. They're just part of our culture, part of the reason this country got started, that it's hard to understand that much of the world doesn't have defined property rights like we do. The advantage of defined property rights is simple. If you own it, you're going to protect it. Now, we haven't always done that, but in today's world, it's a great source of protection. Let me see if I can grab something to drink here. My annual dryness. So insecure forest tenure, which is another way of saying you don't have very good property rights, caused by government claiming ownership of the vast majority of forests in the world. Thank you very much. And this has always been an issue, but it is a particular issue in countries that have gone through a period of colonization. Because one of the things that happened in India was the British Crown claimed control of all these forests, despite the fact many of them had 2,000 to 5,000 years worth of traditional cultural rights over the use of those woods for firewood, for small timbers, for grazing, and so forth and so on. The colonizing empires just wiped those out. And it's easy to poke fun or blame the British or the French or the Belgians. Of course, that's exactly what we did with the Native Americans. We passed them out blankets that weren't very good for them either at the same time. So this has been a trait of colonial empires worldwide over the last 500 years or so, and probably one can go back before that. So they illegally seized the land, they didn't recognize native rights, and then they delegated the authority to forest agencies, which, if you weren't aware of it, it isn't just by happenstance that we all inherited a Prussian tradition. There's a paramilitary tradition to our forest services, state forestry agencies, and so forth, that is very good at controlling things, but not necessarily hypersensitive to local rights. So stopping tropical deforestation requires conversion to forms of private or community property, and there are a lot of examples in India, in Africa, and other parts of the world where property rights in the sense of my wife and I owning 46 acres isn't the way they do it, but a community like East Hartland might own lands that serve the purposes of that community and manage them as a community resource. And if they're strong enough to enforce the rights, it works just the same as private property. So it's not, the world doesn't all have to convert to our particular form of private property, but where we see those kind of social mechanisms, we see the same kind of thing that we see in our society with private property. In India, the most obvious place to see this lesson is much of India was rain-fed agriculture. And when rain-fed agriculture is very seasonal, and because they have a monsoon climate in most of India, as the monsoon rains come in, they start planting rice or whatever crop, and when the rains stop, they stop planting. Big innovation going way back when, back among the oldest in the world, is irrigation. The big advantage of irrigation is you're not so dependent on the local climate and the annual flux of climate. Wherever you find irrigation in South Asia, and it's just as true in Pakistan as in Bangladesh as it is India, you find a set of property rights that you could stick down in Kansas or Iowa and everybody would be very comfortable. This is my land, this is my irrigation, get your cow off of it. But otherwise, when the crop isn't growing in those rain-fed things, there's a set of nomadic relationships where people come in and graze and so forth and so on. And over time, as you build up your animal populations and your human populations, of course, what you've got is a great soil and landscape degradation machine. Okay, summary, same place we started with, climate change and so forth. Now I'm going to pop you to a place in India called Sukamadri. Sukamadri is a relatively small village in northern India. And it just happened that I visited there about the 4th or 5th day I was first in India, and we're talking up. See, where's Delhi? Well, pretty close. It's right up in here. And it's that first uplift of what, at the highest point, is the Himalaya. And what happened was this part of India used to be connected to Australia and Antarctica. And it was broke up in pieces and the plates drifted apart. This plate steamed up from the South Ocean and hit the Asian landmass, and that's why the Himalayas run east and west. Virtually all other major mountains run north and south. But the Himalayas run east and west, and it's because of the enormous pressure which is still going on. So the lower parts of the Himalayas, the foothills, are old ocean beds, and they have all the problems of those kind of soils. They're pretty fragile, they tend to have high pHs, and they are not highly productive. So this is the setting where we're going to go look at this village. And it has had soil erosion problems for over 150 years. It started with mining and timber removal in the 1830s, over a century of overgrazing, and the soil erosion became a downstream issue when the city of Chandigarh was created following partition. When partition happened, Lahore, which was the head of the Punjab, moved to Pakistan side, and they had to create a new city for the independent Indian state of Punjab, and that was called Chandigarh. It's kind of a fascinating city because Mies van der Rohe and some other people of that school of architecture planned the city and then created these buildings that look kind of like the spaceship Galactica out in the middle of nowhere in India. But now it's got a lot of people. It's a very planned, very organized city with a lot of beautiful things, but they created a nice reservoir for drinking water, which worked quite well, and it fed off of these Shavalik Hills. But they also had little sailboats, kind of little yachting clubs, kind of like the little flat bottom boats with sails on them that we use in shallow water. And the keels began to drag on the mud that was floating in here. And these were by Indian standards, upper middle class people, and they started complaining about it, and they got the attention of some folks with their complaints, which led to trying to figure out some solutions. There was a group called Central Soil and Water, which was like our old Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They began installing engineering structures all over, and the villagers immediately ripped them out because they thought the government was trying to get a hold of their land. And a local professional, a fellow named Mishra, was kind of almost a charismatic, visionary, Hindu, very spiritual guy. And a few other professionals said, you know, the problem is we're not working with the people, we're fighting them, let's get in and start working with the people. And they set up the notion that the villagers had to benefit from the rehabilitated watershed, not just the yacht owners down there in Chandigarh. So they started working with the Haryana Forestry Department and the Ford Foundation, and they developed a complicated strategy. And the key was adding small-scale irrigation water to Sukhumabri village. And by small scale, we're talking about what they call tanks, little reservoirs, the size of this room or the size of this building. We're not talking about Hoover Dam or anything like that. We're talking about very small-scale water management things. The advantage of having irrigation was you can grow Mexican wheat. And Mexican wheats are the wonder wheats that the world now uses, and that's why India went from always being on the edge of famine to actually not only feeding itself, but exporting grain to the rest of the world. And it's those short-strawed, big-headed wheats that were the key, but you gotta have water to make them work. You can't, they're not a rain-fed crop. So, now, the cleverness was in the deal, and I worked for the Ford Foundation, and the fellow who was the forester with the Haryana Forestry Department was also a charismatic character. But the people who worked with the Ford Foundation were really artistic on this. And they hired a woman who was an architectural engineer who worked well with the women, and a man who was a universal kind of guy, but he was one of the people. And the two of these people came up with this idea that they were going to have a village association. They were going to have equal sharing of the water by family hearth rather than by acres owned. So if you own 20 acres and you own 2, you both got a share of the water. You had more water than you needed, she had less water than she needed, so you built up a trade. Maybe she had a tractor, so you trade her water to get access to her tractor and stuff like that. So the equal sharing was very important, very counter to the tradition of India. India, just like us, big farmers get more water than little farmers do. Okay? Another thing, they had to take their animals off the landscape and feed them, and these were mainly dairy buffalo. And if you've been near a dairy buffalo, it's kind of like being next to a D9 cat. They're pretty large animals, and they eat a lot. So they went to stall feeding, they went to planting trees and perennial grasses, and they went to protecting their vegetation from the villagers themselves. So the villagers were self-enforcing, plus outsiders. And again, remember those nomadic herders, various other folks coming running through. If you want to keep them from eating your stuff, you got to be out there chasing them off. So the results were very rapid recovery of the landscape. I first saw this in spring of 1982 and just started. By the time I left India, 3.5, 4 years later, the pH had gone down from 9+ down to 7, which is neutral. And that was just the enrichment of the organic material in the soil. Very rapid improvement in the herd quality. You're not going to keep a crappy animal in the stall that you got to feed every day. The animal goes out to slaughter or whatever, and you get yourself a good animal. Great increase in yields and net revenues from farming, and a system of water exchanges. So the rich people had to work with the poor people to get enough water, and the poor people got access to equipment and other things like that. Just to show you the landscape, I always love this picture because how bleak it looks. This is about how that landscape looked when they started. Very bleak. But the black and white makes it look bleaker. Okay, here's the landscape. This is Sukhabadri village there in the mid-distance. You can see the hills denuded. Some planting of stuff around already. This is in 1982 or 83, just about when it started. This is the tractor, the source of milk, the power in a village like this. This chap was pretty proud of his water buffalo there. This is the combines that harvest the wheat. Can you imagine spending 8, 12 hours squatting like that with a little hand thing cutting the wheat? But that's how they did it. And even today, you don't see much in the way of equipment doing this because the fields are so tiny. You know, even with my little tractor, you couldn't turn it around in one of these fields. Perhaps the single biggest innovation, this was the lady architectural engineer, was involving women from each hearth in the system. They were as much a part of the deal as the men. And because they used firewood, because they collected fodder, because a lot of the tending of the cows was with the women, getting them at the table led a powerful voice for conservation and change. All right. If we can move towards sustainable forest management, and by that we simply mean that as we move from decade to decade to decade, we don't see a falling off the cliff. It's not necessarily a totally stable system, but it's not a system that's got an enormous cliff out there where everything goes to hell in a handbasket, if I may be so bold. At the same time, we have the largest middle class in the world. A friend of mine who is middle class in India says, you know, we are the largest middle class in the world. Unfortunately, we are encased by 700 million poor people. But it is true. I mean, if you define middle class in terms of being able to buy goods, it's like good soaps, TVs, Vespas, or even little cars and so forth. This is huge. It's way over 300 million people, probably approaching 400 million now. Very rapid development, very rapid growth in income. But there's a growing conflict between this group and the truly poor, because there's a shift in land use. People like more space, they like more housing for yards, parks, and so forth. And they get into recreation, just as we have. And they get into vistas and beauty. And in India, because of their Hindu traditions, very strong interest in the forest as a source of spiritual communion, even more than ours. The Sierra Club would do wonderfully well there. A lot of the older Sierra Club material is very oriented around the spiritual values of the transcendental period of time in our society. Okay, so looking at India, we have a couple of problems. We have the public and private social benefits that flow from projects, and we have the carbon dioxide abatement sequestration problems. If they're like a dumbbell to two separate problems, then we're going to have to solve them separately with what little connection there is. If they're highly overlapping, like at the bottom, then I think we will come up with some solutions that work in all directions. So we can stop deforestation, we can get people to growing trees for carbon as well as for these other forest-based benefits, then we'll see rapid change in India in terms of the large areas of degraded land that they have. These are some thoughts I share with the Indians, but one of the things that Indians have gotten very good at over the years is statistics. I don't know how many of you know anything about statistics, but statistics, biometrics, forest conservation, all require a highly mathematical turn of mind. And the Indians have always been good at that. There used to be a joke in Iowa State that you couldn't have a stat department without at least two guys named Rao in it. They're very good at this. But they were not very good at measuring their forests for years because the government didn't want to know. And when the FAO and other people finally got the government of India to say, these numbers should be valid and true, India has leapt to the forefront on how to do forest inventory and analysis, and is a great source, working with the US, Canada, and a few other really good countries, some of the European countries, New Zealand, will be a great force to get honest numbers on the world's forests. We need to be looking at a lot of implications of carbon exchanges and carbon taxes. This is a tough one for the US. For the same reason we don't have a unified forest policy. The notion of cap and trade just hit a rock wall. Carbon taxes, the word taxes alone, caused a problem. A friend of mine and I decided over beer one night that we'd name them carbon tipping fees, like going to the dump. But if we don't create incentives to reduce our production of carbon dioxide, we will go on, and we, coupled with China and India, will see global climate change accelerate, not decelerate. There's some talk now in China, and a different kind of talk in India about these problems. If the Chinese and Indians and the Europeans and North America come to some common agreement about how to do this, it will spread to Latin America and ultimately to Africa. Now, Africa is terribly poor, they've got a lot of forests, they've got a lot of problems, but one of the nice things about poverty is you don't produce much carbon dioxide. It's countries that are moving up the ladder rapidly, like Brazil, India, and China, that we have to worry about. And of course, we produce enormous amounts relative per capita to the rest of the world. On the whole, I think one of the lessons we have to share with the world is private forests. Despite the fact that we are not perfect here, our private forests stand up pretty well on sustainability grounds to other kinds of forests in the United States, and particularly if you look overseas. Northern Europe, which has a private forestry tradition, is much better than Southern and Eastern Europe. Our results are generally better than Canada, which, like typical of many of the ex-British countries, most of the forests are owned by the public sector. So I think private forest is something that we can draw lessons from that are applicable to other parts of the world. The fact that we don't have a forest policy is a problem, but on the other hand, what we get done is cheaper than what the public sector does. And for a variety of different reasons. It's not the government can't do anything right. It's just that the government has a tendency when managing something as large as the National Forest to use a cookie cutter approach, whereas I can go out and look at my back 40 and decide I'm going to do this here and do that there, and it's cheap, it's done, no big deal. we need clever thought on institutional designs. Property rights is a bundle of sticks. You guys know this too. All the land trusts are based on the notion that if you can get that conservation easement peeled off, what you're doing basically is taking the property rights and you're giving one of those sticks that is held by a third party, and you prevent development. So with that, I'm going to close and take questions. You've been very patient to listen. I'm going to turn the light on.
What about Ireland? They are pretty thin on big trees.
Well, most of the UK is pretty thin on big
I
trees.
don't know, I've only been there.
Yeah, they cut down all their trees pre-World War I and during World War I. One of the great problems with the reparations, particularly on Germany after World War I, was the British Isles cut down a lot of trees in Germany there. But it also was the inspiration for starting public forestry and private forestry in the UK. So we're seeing the payoffs of that in Scotland. I have not traveled in Ireland, so I can't speak to Ireland, but Scotland's got a lot of forest, and the whole thing sways in unison because of that, as opposed to going in opposite directions, which is how you get the splits. Yeah, he's a master. If anybody can save that tree, it'll be him. And his crew.
Trees that you would recommend that are strong and wind resistant and all of that, do you have like lists of trees or names that
Well,
share to plant, you know, for?
sure. In this climate, with our weather patterns, it's hard to come up with many things other than oak and maple that last more than 50 years with surety. Now, I've got a lot of 75 to 80-year-old pines on my property. If the 38 hurricane comes along again, I'm going to lose an enormous amount of timber. I hope within this next 10 years to get all those tall trees down, but I don't manage by clear cuts. I manage with thinning and selective harvesting because I want a multi-age stand. But pine, once it gets beyond 50, is very susceptible, white pine, very susceptible to wind throw after a lot of rain. And that's what the 38 hurricane was, it's what the 55 flood was. You get the ground saturated, then you bring in one more storm and a little wind and everything, those trees are just like big sails over the air. So, but the oaks, the maples are very hardy, and the easiest way to plant them is to go get naturals on some other part of your property and just move them around. That's how most of them are planted. It's been done with it. The pines are easy because either you get a lot of them naturally, which we have had, or you can buy them from nurseries.
What kind of pine?
Well, we use white pine, but we're also going to do some experiments with western larch from Montana that can withstand the cold, but it's very good. And we've got an inland wetland that comes down from High Meadow, whether it's tied to the High Meadow parking lot, which my father-in-law insists that it is, or it's just a pan underneath there, because have been on the property for the last 80 years like he has. But regardless, we need to replace the pine in that area where the tree is better suited to the wetter soil conditions and larch is.
Are there native larch?
There are native larch, they're generally called tamarack back here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they're native larch back here.
What's the difference between?
More to the north of here. I don't know how common they are in Connecticut. I haven't seen very many of them, except in ornamental plantings. But the reason I would favor bringing in species from Montana is that they're used to the very cold winters. We have a couple of Douglas fir on our property, and they were from Montana. The coastal Douglas fir won't survive here in a harsh winter.
So, with your property, you do harvesting, or do you prefer the forest to naturally?
No, we do harvesting, and the forests of Connecticut are nearing maturity. And if we don't do some form of management, they'll all go down either to disease or to wind.
Oh.
So I strongly favor managing, but I also appreciate some people don't want to do that. And some landscapes, particularly held by land trusts and parks and so forth, they're just going to let them go natural. The one thing that I guarantee is you go back in 50 years, it's not going to look the same.
No.
Because everybody likes that look as it is now, but forests just don't stay the same over a long period of time. These forests actually are very dynamic. It's one of the things that fascinates me because on a per tree basis, they don't grow as fast as the trees in the south or even the part of the Pacific Northwest where I used to work. But my wife can remember various fields in Granby that just weren't there anymore. As she was a kid, and now they're filled in, and so forth and so on. The landscape change is very dynamic. And one of the things that's really interesting about New England, there's parts of the country, you cut down the trees, it would be forever to get new trees. New England, if you stop grazing, stop hay, stop mucking around, they'll fill in with some kind of woody plants, and once you got woody plants, then you're going to progress to hardwoods and maybe some conifers. It's just, that's what this dirt wants to produce, the whole. Yes?
I was up in Pine Top, Arizona a couple of weeks ago, and they have the most beautiful forest of
Quaking aspen and ponderosa pine.
The ponderosa pine.
Yeah, it is
It
gorgeous.
grows right out of the soil that's rocky and.
Yeah, no, it's a very hardy
amazing.
species.
Yes.
I grew up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, right below the ponderosa pine. We had digger pine, which is like a pinyon pine. But as you go up, you get into the ponderosa country. And it's just a gorgeous forest, and there's nothing like walking through ponderosa pine on a warm day. It's just,
That's right.
you know where you are.
Absolutely, no question about it. Now, what is happening with the American chestnut? I know that the experiment station.
The experiment station is doing a lot of work. ESF Syracuse was doing a lot of work on trying to come up with genetic improvements. The American Chestnut Foundation is sponsoring a major breeding program, and what they're doing is back-crossing American chestnut with Chinese, and they're trying to minimize the impact of the Chinese, except for that gene that's resistant to the chestnut blight. For reasons that I don't fully understand, but virtually all trees diseases start in Asia, moved from Asia to Europe, and then either jumped to the Western Hemisphere or got brought here more commonly on planting stock and the like. So our chestnut, of all the global chestnuts, was the least resistant to this blight. The Chinese is very resistant. So what they're trying to do is these back crosses, which would have about 1/20th of the genetic composition, but the right 1/20th being resistant. I have several hybrid seedlings growing on my property that I've got from the American chestnut farmers. I started off with 25, and I think I've got 10 left. And each year, one more catches the blight. But I've got some, I had one that I thought was, man, I got this tree, it was taller than the inside of the seedling, then all of a sudden, kaboom. But we have some now, and we're now
I guess
7 or 8 years beyond planting, and they start showing any signs. So I'm hopeful that some of these will be resistant.
yes, and I guess the Italian chestnut is quite resistant.
Much more so than ours. Ours, because of the isolation of the North American continent from Europe and Asia, just had no resistance whatsoever. Sort of like the Native Americans and their lack of resistance to smallpox. Similar kind of problem, that you isolate species for long periods of time, and there's not that evolutionary pressure to maintain that resistance, so it slowly dissipates.
That's true, we tried growing them too, and when you got to approximately the 3rd year, they really just were overtaken by the blight. It was just a shame.
What to me is so interesting is that forevermore I'll have sprouts coming out of these ones that have done. They'll continue to re-sprout, And a friend of mine who's now passed away at the Harvard Forest used to make soil poultices and sort of put them on with a giant bandage over the starting, and that would kill the blight. But, you know, as the tree gets bigger, it's hard to have a soil cast on it big enough to prevent that. But his point was there is stuff in the soil that the blight fungus doesn't like, and then you can isolate that, but I don't know what work's being done on that. But several groups are working on, and there's a terrific woman down in New Haven at the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station working on it.
Yes,
It
and
has a long Greek name that I can't remember.
And then actually, I guess up on the Gas Bay, they do have an American chestnut forest up there that is quite successful up to this point.
Okay, that I'm not familiar with. They did find a stand down in the southern Appalachians in northern Georgia, and they don't know yet whether it's resistant or was isolated. And both can happen.
Any other questions?
In like southeastern Connecticut, where I go hunting a lot, you know, it's a wildlife management area.
Right,
They do forestry down there, and clearing, like major clearing.
right,
stuff
right.
like that.
That state forest right on the Rhode Island line does a lot.
Yeah, and it's just much more managed.
Yes.
You know, you come up here and it's like a bomb run. You know, it's like,
Well,
who is that? Is that just a county forester or?
no, it's the state, it is their largest state forest. They've been lucky enough to have some really superb silvicultural foresters there over the years. But the state of Connecticut has been pulling resources from forestry for the last 30, 40 years. And it's very sad because this state had the first state forester in the United States. And it built up a very strong set of state forests, which were all demonstration forests for the private sector for many years. The state forester was part of the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. And this was a very good tradition until after, well, there was some erosion back in the 30s, but after World War II, as other problems cropped up, the state started withdrawing resources from the forestry sector. State parks, the same thing, wildlife. So we aren't spending near the energy and effort on forest and wildlife conservation now than we were a few generations ago. And that's sad, but it's part of the problem of modern society with the urgent driving out the important.
Yeah, 'cause it's just odd, like 5 years ago, you know, they do a nice job.
Yep.
Clump up the brush.
Yep.
And, you know, and they could put it down
Yep.
like a good cover and everything, and
Yep.
up here, it's just like.
No, they haven't had effective forest management in most of the local state forests in 2 generations.
Yeah.
And it's just, you've got one forester over Pleasant Valley and another one over near
So,
Torrington.
is it
There's just
county
no,
foresters that decide?
no, we have very few county foresters. These are state DEP foresters.
Uh-huh.
But it used to be that we had, say, 50 in the state, now we have under 25.
Okay.
And they don't have anybody, you know,
Yeah.
you need woods workers and so forth. Don't have any of that. And unfortunately, a lot of atrophy happened during the Roland years. And I'm not sure why then, but he clearly didn't think much of DEP or forestry. So he sold the Ballintown Nursery. It was a great resource for small landowners throughout the state, and did a lot of things that were just very sad. And I'm sure there were other priorities compelling the change, but it's just, you know, sometimes we toss out the baby with the bathwater to make these changes.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Association, Hartland Land Trust.
Very good. Stick it up my window.
Any way you'd like. Notebooks work really well.
Okay. And thank you, Susan, for the use of your computer, and thank whoever the projector came from.
I did want to mention that all our presentations and guest speaker series are available on Granby Community TV on the website. And you can see any one, it's gctv14.org. 16.org, excuse me. And you don't need to watch them on TV, you can just go to the internet and look them up, and they're all listed right there. So please feel free to view any of the past ones.
And
Also, we have a sign-in sheet, which we'd like everybody to sign in if you know that you are here. We accept donations if you'd like, and refreshments are available. Thank you very much for coming.